You don't want the same old boring rocks as everybody else.
You want something stackable, flippable, re-arrangeable, or maybe even a little bit exotic. And you can have it all for the grand old price of $3.33. You see, all this yellow foam came out of a skip. So my weapons of choice are 2 kitchen knives. I suspect that this is PIR foam. It is the most commonly used foam in the UK for construction, but you do not want to cut this with a hot wire. I've drawn some random-ish shapes, just using a Sharpie on the top of the foam, and the first pass for the knife is just to trace the shapes out. The second path is a stabbing motion. This allows us to penetrate right through the entire foam. Because we've used the tracing pass before, we can just follow that to make sure that we're cutting in the places where we actually want to be cutting. Then I'm just going to use the edge of my desk to snap this piece clean away. We've already got some really interesting textures, and with a little bit of extra work we could develop these into some really good looking rocks, but this really isn't the look that I want to go for on this build. I want this terrain set to look like Martian cliff faces. So I've got a few reference photographs from the old rover, and after all of our foam has been cut out, we can really start to see what we're working with. The medium-sized pieces of foam will end up being about half the size of the larger pieces and twice the size of these smaller pieces. And then if we half the thickness of these smaller pieces, we can use them as steps. Just from the cutting and snapping, these pieces are already starting to look pretty cool, but to achieve that Mars look, we need to go from this to this. And the process is pretty straightforward, to be quite honest. All you need is the same kitchen knife that you had earlier on, and I believe in America you call these a box cutter. Keeping your digits well out of the way, just use the sharp side of the knife and start scoring into the foam. Then flip your knife and use the blunt side and score into the foam. Then grab your kitchen knife and repeat that same process. Sharp side, blunt side. And using some of those scoring marks that we've already made, you can use a kitchen knife to flick bits off the top face off the rock. Then to start creating some of those deeper striations, we'll use the blunt side of the kitchen knife and just drag it across all of the scoring work that we've just done. Then follow that up by using the kitchen knife just to flick chunks of the striations out from the centerpiece of the rock. It's a really easy thing to do, but make sure you then go in and carve more carvings, because there would be carvings there where some of the rock has fallen away. Then it really is just a case of rinse and repeat until you get the texture that you're looking for. This can be a very messy process, so I do suggest having a hoover on standby to clear up your mess, and also to actually clean up some of the carving work on the foam. Still some cleaning up work that needs to be done, but you can see the effect already, and now I've just got to repeat this process everywhere on this rock where there's a side profile. Because these pieces of foam came out of an old property, they've all got some quite interesting textures on them already, but just using my box cutter, I'm going to add some extra chipping to the top surface of the rock just to make the edges that bit more interesting, remembering to add further striations to all the little chips that we've pulled out. And on these larger pieces, I also want to add some angled but vertical cut marks into the rock just using the back of my knife. And like I said earlier, this is a very messy process. It is well worth cleaning up as you go along, just to make your own life a little easier. And then finally, just to clean up all the carving, I've got an old paintbrush that I'm just going to use to get as much of the little bits of rubble or, well, it's just foam, isn't it, at this point? But because this foam is quite staticky, for very much want of a better word, a lot of the, let's call it debris, or foam from the carving process can get stuck in the striations. So you do need something to get in there and get all that stuff out. Next up is base coating. Mod Podge, and I've got some purple paint. Ignore the purple, I'm not painting the rocks purple, it's just so I can actually see what I'm doing. And to give the rocks a tougher exterior, because foam, as we know, is quite soft, I have a big old tub of stuff that I can't get open. Plaster of Paris. Now, because we've got so much detail in these rocks, we want the mixture to be quite runny so that it settles in all the places where we want the paint to settle. But because plaster of Paris dries from a chemical process rather than air drying, your mixture can get very lumpy and very cloggy quite quickly. So the best process I found for mixing this concoction is to mix a plaster of Paris and water first, but again, leave it quite runny. Then add Mod Podge, mix it, then you paint, and then mix it again. But make sure each stage is thoroughly mixed before you add the next ingredient. This is then liberally slapped all over these foam rocks, but it will take at least 2 coats to get decent coverage. But when you do, it will look like this. And now I have to repeat that process 1 or 2 more times to get a full set. Once everything had been base coated with the plaster mix, it was time to lay down the mid-tone and the wash. I've already done that with these 4 larger static pieces. These 4 pieces aren't meant to be stackable. And it's exactly the same process as before, just less the plaster of Paris. And this time grey instead of purple. I'm just using grey because again I'm working from reference photographs from NASA. This is before colour adjustment and this is after. But I don't want that light blue colour because I want to be able to use these rocks with other boards. I'm also going to take some influence from the patterning on my pet rock. This had quite an influence on how I actually applied the wash. I was pretty liberal with it. I slapped it on in quite thick. Well, I put a lot of it on. And then I used kitchen roll or kitchen towel to dab off as much of the excess as possible, trying to leave some suggested pattern on the actual rock, and also leaving nice dark, deep recesses in all of the crevices that we've been carving out. Now it is worth remembering that we're still working with some very complicated shapes and foam, so inevitably there's a little bit of missed coverage and some pieces will snap off occasionally. To remedy that issue at this stage, I took some of the black wash and some extra black paint to mix somewhere in between a wash and a paint, and I used this to then cover up all the little snap sections, any gaps in coverage, and I also used it in the very deep recesses in some of these striations just to emphasize and push that contrast of light and dark a little bit further. Then it was time for a visit from our old friend Neutral Grey. It was at this stage I knew I was onto a winner, In the month of May, I'd actually played more games on this half-finished terrain than I had played games in total for the first 4 months of the year. The people that I played wanted to borrow the terrain, and then the people that they played also wanted to borrow it too. It took me 3 weeks to get the stuff back so I could move on to the next stage. But thankfully, now it's late June, it's only a couple of passes with a dry brush. These are already looking pretty good, but for me, they just need lightened up a touch. So just using that neutral grey for the first pass, I'm just dry brushing in a downward motion just to catch all the edges of the striations. So this side is without dry brushing, and this side is with dry brushing. Now, dry brushing is pretty easy work, to be quite fair, but I had a lot of it to do. This is what the top surfaces of the rocks look like once those have been dry brushed as well. Again, the same neutral grey. Here is an after and before shot of the flat top surfaces of the rocks. You can see the after a little lighter on the sides too. It's a very light dry brush. There's not a lot of paint on my brush at all, and I am just scuffing the surface just to bring the tone up a couple of notches. I'm using a circular motion just to try and avoid any kind of brush marks on the surface, and this also gives you a very even coverage. I follow up that neutral grey with Army Painter's Ash Grey. These two colours have a really nice contrast, and it's a really light dry brush. I'm only trying to tickle the edges. This is how all the rocks turned out. There's lots of physical and painted texture using really simple techniques, and no grout, which I'm quite thankful of. I only have a little room to craft in, and I'm very pleased with how they came out. This is my dice box. Do you remember those 4 larger static pieces that I showed you earlier on? Well, I'm rolling 4 d6s because each of those static pieces has been numbered 2 through to 5. I'm going to ignore the 1, and now I'm going to focus on 2, 4 and 5. This bit that's been cut into the side of these pieces, that's so that I can actually comfortably fit them onto the frame of this board. If we just move this one up a bit, I can hide a tank round the corner. This is the other static piece, number 3. And with a couple of extra pieces added, it completely changes the dynamic of the entire board. But of course, you don't necessarily need to use the static pieces either. You could just use the individual rocks, or a combination of the two. There's endless configurations for a numerous amount of boards, but of course you could just stack the rocks and pile them high.
Alright Dave, what's the final set look like?
Let me show you. So I set out to build Mars, and it was at this point I realised I hadn't just built Mars, I'd built quite an extensive and cavernous cave system. And then I thought, can I recreate that scene from that famous space opera film trilogy thing You know, the one where the bad guy chops off the leg and the arms of the leg. The one where the bad guy cuts off 3 appendages from the good guy.
You are my brother, Anakin!
What is necessary?